Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Village podcast. In this episode, we have Samara Concepcion, who is a doula, film director, a fellow podcast host as well. I actually listened to Samara's podcast in preparation for the birth of Olivia Rose, and I think it's one of the most underrated podcasts out there. So we will be leaving those links below. And I'm so excited to speak to her all about ecstatic birth.
It's a birth which reflects the intention to take a woman beyond her usual self. A lot of what the hospitals are doing these days is not really for the benefit of mothers and children, is really to protect them against litigation. I deeply believe that if our mothers are well, we're all well.
So let's get going. Samara, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us why you're so passionate about birth?
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Samara Concepcion. I'm a holistic birth keeper, a women's health practitioner, and a multidisciplinary artist based in London. My background is very much in dance and somatic movement, so I very much integrate those practices in supporting women at all stages, really, but especially pregnancy and birth. And the reason I got into this work is because I see mothers as really the source of our collective health, and I deeply believe that if our mothers are well, we're all well. At least the foundation's strong and healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It has the ripple effect. I always talk about the ripple effect of, like, the birth and postpartum and how mothers feel we're raising the future generations. And yeah, it's so important.
Exactly.
So let's dive in. How would you describe ecstatic birth? What is it?
I love that question. And I personally love the root meaning of the word ecstatic, because it literally means to be taken beyond the usual self. And to me, this is what an ecstatic birth is. It's a birth which reflects nature's intention to take a woman beyond her usual self into an altered state of consciousness, so that she can be transformed on every level as she enters motherhood.
Wow, gosh, I've never heard that definition before.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of kind of modern associations with the word ecstatic that I think can be a bit misleading, because then it kind of sets this expectation. And our modern association with it has got a lot to do with bliss and pleasure, right? And I think that's really misleading when it comes to birth, because it creates a really unfair expectation, for mothers, for it to like be all bliss and exquisite, and if you don't have that, then somehow you failed. But really, I mean, birth is so much more than that. And I think if you go into a birth experience open to the potential to feel pleasure, then you also need to be as open to feel like the rest of the spectrum of emotions and feelings and sensations that it has to offer too. Yeah, because it has so much to offer, right? I mean, you would know.
Yeah, I mean, the way
That's
that
so
you've just
wow.
described that, I would say my birth was ecstatic, but had you not have said it in that way, I would have said absolutely not. It was intense and crazy, wild journey. But that's such an interesting definition. I feel so much more comfortable with that.
Great. And then we can acknowledge that a lot of women are having ecstatic births, because that is the design. That's the natural design of birth. It's for it to be ecstatic in this way,
Yeah,
Yeah.
gosh, I love that. Great. I didn't know what you were going to say with that one. We may have been having a very different conversation. So what would you say are the biggest myths surrounding birth?
There are many. I would say I've become very interested in this in my documentary film, obviously, in the project. I would say that the most deeply ingrained myths about birth are that birth is inherently dangerous, that it's inherently painful, and that it always requires medical attention and assistance for it to unfold safely. I would say those are the three big ones.
And
Yeah.
where do you think that we've learned these ideas, these myths from?
Gosh, I think the handed down to us very, very early on. I mean, we grew up hearing these stories, whether it's, through our mother's experience, aunt's experiences, and then they kind of get reinforced because it's such a strong belief system, then that will therefore have such a profound influence on how women actually experience it. It's just reinforced.
The kind of questions that honestly keep me up at night and really get me thinking. But one of the things I've been thinking about lately is the placenta injection after birth. And I did a post just talking about, if you want to birth your placenta physiologically, then the optimum environment is quiet, safe, familiar. And you have a choice, because it's routinely offered, obviously, as you know. And a midwife came back to me and said, I appreciate your work as a doula, but you're stepping completely out of guidance here. You and I know that the placenta injection is the safest option, instead of a physiological birth of the placenta. Anyway, I sat with it for a bit before I replied. And eventually I replied and I said, if you subscribe to the notion that every woman should have the synthetic oxytocin to birth her placenta, then you also subscribe to the notion that birth is inherently flawed by design. That's what you're saying. And if I was a midwife and I was learning and I was going through the textbooks and I read that, I would be asking questions. I would never take something like that at face value. I'd be saying, well, hold on a minute, let's look at the research. Is it because these births are medicalized already that we need to then medicalize the ending? Because we can't expect, a woman to be induced and then her own oxytocin levels to suddenly, hey, let's kick back in at the birth of the placenta. Of course, we then need to medicalize the end. And likewise, if you're in an environment that's cold, undisturbed, unfamiliar, and someone's rubbing your baby and congratulations, happy birthday, baby, and suddenly the whole flow, the hormonal flow is disrupted, of course it's going to be safer to have an injection. But to outright say without asking questions, then we're saying birth is flawed. Same with the hat. If you think that every baby needs a hat, you don't believe that birth is safe by design. The same goes for, women being induced at 39 weeks. That being safer than a natural onset. You agree that birth is not safe by design. Like honestly, these things, I'm just so like bemuseled how people can just agree with these huge things. Do you know what I mean? Like, I seriously, stuff just seriously keeps me up at night.
Of course. And these beliefs are so deeply ingrained, and they're so deeply ingrained that they're really difficult to see as myths because they've been integrated into the norm and the system. And of course, if you've grown up being told that someone outside of yourself knows what is better for you and your baby than yourself, then of course you're going to take, these suggestions as as what's best. It goes hand in hand with that belief. Of course, you're just going to go with what, the so-called expert. And don't get me wrong, of course, you and I know that sometimes their support is absolutely needed and life-saving, but most of the time it isn't. It isn't. And what a shame, when a woman has done all that work of moving through a physiological birth and her whole body is prepared, has kind of climbed the mountain, and that oxytocin has built up for her to eventually be able to release the placenta. She's done all that hard work, and then that gets deeply interfered with an injection.
And I think it's one of those things that well, for my personal experience of this was Juniper. I had a physiological birth. I was in hospital. Before I know it, injection is in my thigh. Just, this is going to be safer. It's going to prevent you from bleeding. Dush. No consent given. And I truly believe that interfered in a big way with the bond that I felt with Juniper, and that kind of the birth culminating in that oxytocin high, which I got to experience with Olivia when I was in the pool just breastfeeding. I could feel my uterus contracting. I could feel the oxytocin pulsing through my veins. And I remember, like, I had lots of layers of thinking going on, but one of them was like, I can't believe I'm having this moment. Like, this was the moment that was taken for me, and I didn't get to have this, but I'm having it now. And I can remember just feeling my face was flushed. I'm looking at my baby. my uterus is contracting. I know that placenta's coming, it's detaching. And I just knew that this is physiological birth and it feels ecstatic and wonderful. And I'm bonding and I'm feeling the rush of love. And I just couldn't believe it was happening to me. And I actually think that we should talk more about that placenta injection. There needs to be some more research done. In terms of like the hospital management, I totally can see how, from a convenience point of view, having that injection is, tick, birth done. We know that when the placenta's finished, the birth is done for everyone in that room. So it's interesting, isn't it? There's so much more to it.
And it takes time, and this is the thing, the more undisturbed primal physiological birth I observe, the more I see that placentas can take time to come out physiologically. Even if the woman is undisturbed, bonding with her baby in that oxytocin high, like I've seen placentas take 4, 5, 6 hours sometimes, which would be totally alarming to a medical midwife. But the mum is looking absolutely fine. She's able to focus on her baby. She's able to speak coherently. She's not overbleeding. And then, so what? The placenta will take the time it needs to take. Sometimes it's psycho-emotional, psychosomatic. Like the mum's just gone through a massive experience. And on some level, she needs time to integrate and be with her baby and just take a pause before letting the placenta go, which really marks the end of the pregnancy, right? And it would make sense that some women need more time than others. Like I was once a birth doula for a dear friend of mine who was a professional boxer for a very long time in her life, and she was so used to holding things together. And her birth was very rapid, very easeful, but her placenta just wouldn't come out. Now, I'm not going to say how long it took for it to come out because people are going to judge it big time, but it took a long time. And we had to do a lot of talking, and she had to have a really big cry and fall apart for that placenta to come out.
Wow.
And I think that the birth experience kind of shocked her so much that everything tensed up, and she needed a few hours of reassurance and love and warmth and care and bonding and breastfeeding for everything to just open up again and that placenta to come out. And that needs to be spoken about too, right? We're not machines. We've just gone through a big emotional experience after having given birth, and different people need different things for that placenta to come out. It can't just be the same story for everyone. It doesn't work like that.
And we need to think about what's going on in, hormonally. You're getting peak levels of oxytocin. I know Sarah Buckley says that that's the most oxytocin we will ever have in our bodies at any time in our whole lives. And oxytocin is, love hormone. It's for the bonding, the breastfeeding. And so there's a case for waiting to enable those hormones, that hormonal flow, and the completion of the birth.
Yeah. What I find really interesting as well is that physiologically, hormonally speaking, when the baby emerges, there's this surge of adrenaline. There's this peak of adrenaline in the body, right? There's all the catecholamines as the baby comes out, so that the mother and the baby are incredibly alert to the environment and to each other. But then that peak needs to descend, and then oxytocin needs to take over, right? So that's why we want to treat that kind of whole phase as we were treating the birth itself, low lights, just dim, relaxed environment, no pressure. The placenta needs that to be born too. And actually, pressure, putting any pressure on the woman at that stage when her adrenaline is high, actually ironically, puts her at risk of overbleeding. Does that make sense?
That's it.
That's it. Yeah.
Oh, I'm loving this conversation. So you talk a lot about the kind of mind-body awareness in your work. Talk to us more about that. What is it? What does it mean?
Well, truth is, birth is a body-led experience, right? It's not a mind-led experience. And I say this to all my mama clients, like, look, we can sit here talking about birth all day long, and I can do it for days. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But it's not necessarily going to prepare us for the experience of birth. And one of my favorite birth educators out there, and I'm sure we'll get into her work in this episode, Sherry Winston, a holistic sexuality teacher who was a midwife for a very, very long time. And she really says that the best way to prepare for birth is anything that gets you into a trance, right? If you if you wanna like that's the closest preparation, to an actual birth experience that you can get. So anything that softens your rational brain and that really gets you into your body, into a trance, whether that is movement, singing, sex, she says that that's the best practice, really. But anything that does that for you, and again, that's deeply personal, is the best like the best birth prep you could ever hope for. And so this is really when I bring the kind of somatic movement practices into the work, not only with women on a one-to-one, but inviting partners too, where we can just get comfortable being in a non-rational, non-verbal space together, where we go deep within the body and we use the timeless tools of breath, movement, and sound to either amplify what feels really good in the body, but to also we use those exact same tools to dissolve what any tension or holding or stagnation. And those are tools that we can bring into the birth space. But what I find really interesting is that as much as we may want or wish for a natural birth, I think we're so just not used to entering a nonverbal, deeply somatic, altered state of consciousness in our daily lives that we may really want this natural birth, but inevitably, if we don't have a taste of what that feels like, it's going to be really scary when we enter it and we might panic. So it's just getting the body accustomed to being in a just different kind of space yeah.
You and I have such similar philosophies. This is something I talk about a lot, and I actually think it's one of the biggest problems that the modern woman faces is how do you leave your poised neocortex sort of, persona into the primitive, the animalistic, the body, that kind of
Yes.
the way that labor pulls you into move in a certain way. How do you go from this working at the office, sedentary, into this kind of experience? How do we bridge that gap? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges. And when I work with doula clients, I will quite quickly pick up on that, like how far are they over here, and what work can we do to get them over here. In birth box, I get them to do vocalizations with their birth partner and think like, do you feel uncomfortable moving right now? And if so, why? Is it because you're out of the persona and you're doing something that is more primitive and so it's so interesting that you also talk about this, because I actually feel as though this is a bigger conversation. Like this is really, really big.
Of course. And to me, it really brings up the question of the birth witnesses, the birth team that you gather around yourself, because can you allow yourself to go there in their presence, under their gaze?
Mm.
Right? Because you may be able to find that on your own in your room whilst you're listening to music. But can you go there, I don't know, under your mother's gaze or whoever you're going to invite into that
Such an
space? And
important
that's
question.
really, really important. Because naturally there will be people with whom you can really go there and people who you can't. And if you're feeling their gaze during your birth experience as you're attempting to go into trance, or you may not feel them, but you might feel their discomfort. I think one of the reasons why I love the birth space so much is because I'm so familiar with that body-led experience as a dancer. Like I feel most at home there. It's just all stripped, all bare. Like for me, that's just I love it. And I think because I'm so comfortable in it, and so unafraid of it, I can put the birthing woman more at ease, and then she can kind of feel my complete comfort. And I think that's really important, that the people surrounding you in birth are comfortable in that kind of more primal, visceral, messy space.
Totally. So when you work with your doula clients, what are the kind of common fears that you see coming up time and time again, and how do you help women through those fears?
To be completely honest with you, I would say that most of my mama clients know deep, deep down that they can do it. they want this natural birth and they know that they can do it. So their fears are more often to do with something in their birth environment distracting them, interfering, intervening, taking them out of their trance, and, potentially sabotaging the birth experience. So we have a whole lot of conversations about how to really protect that space for her. And I think a really important conversation to have around this is, of course, what protects and preserves the integrity of birth, this, natural blueprint of birth. But also, how can we protect this no matter how the birth unfolds? I've found that brings a whole lot of reassurance to the mothers, and to really get the birth partners or whoever's going to be present on board with this. But a really great step-by-step process that I find really, really helpful when it comes to disarming fears, which I'm going to share here just because I think it's just a really nice journaling practice, is first one really, like, firstly, just become aware, like face the fears that come up. You might have many, but the first step is really to acknowledge that there is a fear. The second one, really based on research, is how likely is this fear or this experience to occur? How likely is it to occur? The next step would be to really acknowledge what is within your control in terms of preventing this from occurring, and then also what is not within your control. And then the last step, which I think is key here, is that if that fear was to come to fruition, what conversations can you have? What steps can you take to ensure that you will feel held and cared for throughout, regardless? I'm just going to offer that here because I feel like it's a valuable little simple step-by-step.
I love that so much. And the biggest sort of thing that I would take away from that is how likely, because often what you'll find is not very likely.
Exactly.
So you just touched on this briefly, but for people who don't really understand, what does it mean when we say birth has become medicalized?
Such an interesting question. I mean, I always like looking at the medical model as a field of belief, right? It was created, anything in this life, is created, is founded on beliefs and ideas, right? And so it's really a system that was founded on the belief that birth on some level is flawed, and that modern science and medicine can improve it and fix it and save it. But it's misguided in the sense that it's not really looking at the natural design of birth, which, as doulas, a lot of our work is is to preserve and understand it, and really actually understand what makes birth safe, which I think a whole lot of people aren't aware of. We're talking about a very, like, evolutionarily optimized birth blueprint here that works the same for all mammals, and it is intended to be safe and easeful. If it wasn't, we'd be in trouble. We wouldn't be here, right? I think what's happened with the medical model of birth is that it's focused a whole lot on risk prevention. And I mean, it's a very complicated situation because a lot of what the hospitals are doing these days is not really for the benefit of mothers and children, is really to protect them against litigation. And that's something to really be aware of. So, this tick box kind of system that you were mentioning earlier, that's really to protect them more so. Once you know the work of Dr. Sarah Buckley, who's, probably one of the people out there who's like dived into this hormonal blueprint that I'm talking about the most. But once you have a really deep understanding of that, then you'll be able to see the medical model as as a system, as a set of beliefs and protocols and guidelines that aren't necessarily supportive to what nature intends for birth, which is this ecstatic experience. And what's really unfortunate about a hospital environment, as much as we can have conversations with the team, and as much as actually the last birth that I supported unfolded in a hospital, and the mama had a beautiful experience, so it's entirely possible. But when it comes to entering this altered state, it's going to just be naturally challenging to enter it if you're in an environment that requires you to answer questions. And, there's going to be putting pressure on yourself, more coming from the pressure that they are under. So there's a whole lot of layers to be aware of here. I'm not sure if that really answers the question, because it's, such a big one, but
It's huge.
yeah.
Yeah, I would agree that, most people listening to this will be giving birth at hospital. So it is just thinking about, okay, we know that hospital isn't set up for physiological birth in the way that it's usually bright lights, unfamiliar faces. Usually you're probably not going to see that midwife that you met the whole time. And then I would say also just the number of routine interventions, the VE that's offered every 3 to 4 hours, the blood pressure checks that go on that you feel that kind of make that noise, the CTG that keeps slipping off and that someone needs to pull back up. And so all of these kind of things that feel sort of minor end up potentially disrupting that hormonal flow and that woman's ability to drop deeper into her state of calm. And so the way that what I say to my clients giving birth at hospital is just don't go in too early. So you're minimizing the amount of time that you spend there. And also just make sure that you've got your birth partner who can shield you, and a birth plan that is super bulletproof, that shows that you are, very clear about your wishes and that you want them to be hands off, and that you, like, I go as far as to say that you understand, like state that you understand the risks of, not having that routine VE, so that they feel covered as well, because there is that fear of litigation. And then just ensure that your birth partner's trying their hardest to protect your zone and switch those lights off and have that eye mask, and have these conversations in the prenatal period as well, so that your healthcare team really understand your wishes. The birth plan that I wrote with for Olivia's birth, I've said this before, but it was quite poetic in that, like, I took them on a journey, and I really wanted them to read that plan and say, wow, like, this is a human being, this is a mother with a vision. And I actually pleaded with them. I said, please help me. Can you facilitate this for me? This is the birth I want. And I would hope that someone reading it would be like, oh wow, like, okay, it's not just another person, like, this is someone who really wants this experience. So anything that you can do in the antenatal period to communicate your wishes, and just generally speaking, don't spend too long there if you can avoid it, because obviously the longer that you spend there, the more chances of more disturbances and potentially more interventions.
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
And I don't know if you've heard the saying, like, the thank goodness stories. So those stories that emerge, women who have had hospital births who will come out and say, thank goodness I was in hospital, but they're not actually looking at what happened at the birth. And actually, can you trace back the first intervention that led to the cascade of interventions? And actually, if you had not had that intervention, would this have happened? Most interventions are not necessary. They were never necessary. And so, but all of those stories that now, are getting told everywhere, people go, oh gosh, I better go to hospital. And then your whole framework is just, full of births with lots of interventions, which reinforce the idea that it's medicalized and that it needs to be. But actually, if you look in the detail of those births, you so often see that none of it needed to happen.
Yeah, and that's a really hard thing to face. I mean, one shield that I just value so much is, your birth education, really looking into Sarah Buckley's work, this whole hormonal physiology that we're talking about. It's interesting, a lot of the couples that I support, they say that after having looked into that, when they receive these kind of birth horror stories, or, thank goodness I was in hospital, they just quietly know within themselves, through their education, through what they know in their experience, that they have a sense of where that birth was, you know, derailed or where there was too much intervention. And that's an incredible shield, because the fear or the energy that's coming to you with the story that's very, very charged and that often is unintegrated, right? A lot of women experience these massive things and then actually don't actually have the appropriate support to integrate it and go a bit deeper into it and see, you know, where things really changed, you know, where they derailed potentially. But once you have this birth education, these stories don't get to you in the same way. I just find that it's really helpful to have your birth education as a foundation, because these horror stories are going to keep coming to you, but they have much less of an impact if you have.
And maybe there's people listening who walk that path as well. And we're definitely not saying that all interventions are unnecessary. It's just a fact that most of them are. And of course, you know, like you said, in the middle of this conversation, we welcome the interventions that are necessary. There's a time and a place, and when it's needed, you know, we are saying thank goodness. But it's about trying to not be part of that statistic, you know. I know some hospitals here in the UK are inducing over 50% of women.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's alarming in itself. But yeah, just again, great resource when it comes to inductions of labor. Sarah Wickham's book, In Your Own Time, really great resource to read during your pregnancy, way before any mention of induction comes your way, because then you have your ground again and it lands differently.
That's
you
it.
know?
And
Yeah.
it's so worth it. Even if you do end up giving birth bang on your due date and you don't end up having that conversation, it's actually just really interesting to know these things, and you can share that knowledge on with your fellow pregnant friends too. I love that book. It's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, we have covered a lot. But my final question to you is, you know, for that anxious mum who's listening to us, thinking all these thoughts, going on this journey with us, what would be your kind of one piece of advice for something they can go and do after this conversation to help them feel more prepared for the birth?
I mean, firstly, you've got this. You know, you have absolutely all it takes within yourself to have. I mean, if you know your desire is to have a natural physiological birth, it's already there. You know, and I think the practice or the preparation towards that is actually something to really look forward to, because as we were saying earlier, anything that gets you out of your mind into your body, and again, that's deeply personal, but think about the things that just take you to a whole other space, whether that's dance or art or music or whatever that might be, or sensuality, whatever that might be. That's the best birth prep you could ever have.